So Akash, in complete honesty, I haven't read the book, but
okay.
but I'm really excited because I get a chance to get an autographed copy of it from the author. And what a book it is. You got the New York Times best book for 2021. That's absolutely amazing. So India's always been this sort of seen as this country of godmen and seen as sort of this place where people go in for the spiritual conscious. And Auroville is a testament to humanity's potential to peacefully coexist, since it required people to embrace a new philosophy and abandon their long-held belief systems. Auroville today remains of great fascination and mystery to people in search of an escape from the consumerist and materialistic world. What do you think we can learn from the Auroville community that can help assuage the polarization within communities today?
Okay, that's a big question. What can we learn from Auroville? I guess, Auroville it's a complicated place. I've spent most of my adult life there, and it exists at many levels. So there's the kind of ideological, philosophical, utopian level of Auroville, which offers both some good lessons but also some cautionary lessons. And then there's the lived level of Auroville, where things are actually happening and not always according to plan. So I think the book in some ways explores the tension between those two levels. I guess so I would say, yes, there can be communities that are idealistic and that bring people together looking for different things. And that's certainly one of the lessons of Auroville, that these places can exist despite all odds against them and can exist for 50-some years. A cautionary lesson would be that the original goal or ideals you set out with are not the way it always plays out necessarily. In terms of the lived experience, I think without doubt, the biggest success in Auroville has been the ecological work, which was not part of the original plan. In fact, the original plan was to build quite a sort of concrete city, in the style of 60s kind of high modernism. But because these sort of idealistic people ended up on a plateau, a deserted plateau with nothing on it, they improvised and they planted, I think it's something like over 3 million trees, and it's probably the most successful, reforestation project in India at this stage. I think that's one of the great lessons and one of the great gifts that Auroville offers to India and to the world at the moment.
This book also addresses how John Walker relied on his family's wealth to set up a cashless system in Auroville. So in this context, Utopia could only perhaps materially exist somewhere between the ideal and the real. And you've touched upon that already. What do you think is the perfect balance?
Okay, so maybe, for those who haven't read the book, it's worth saying who John Walker is for a moment, because what the book is, essentially it's a complicated sort of mix of genres, and at some level it's a history of Auroville, and then it's an exploration of the concept of utopia. It's also, at some level, a family memoir. And so, and in particular, it's an exploration of the deaths of my wife's parents. Her adoptive father, John Walker, who was an American man who died at the age of 44, and her mother, Diane Maes, who was Belgian. And so they died when she was 14. She, I, and most of the community never fully understood what had happened. There were sort of murky, strange circumstances. And then my wife, Auralice, and I return, more than 2 decades later to Auroville, and we start sort of piecing together what happened and how they died. Just to give context on who John Walker is. So that's who John Walker is. It's true that he came from a very wealthy, privileged family, on both sides. His father, they lived in Georgetown. His father was director of the National Art Gallery. He was really one of the founding members. They hobnobbed with, the Kennedys, Isaiah Berlin, all these people were in their social circle. He went to Harvard. He grew up in tremendous privilege and wealth, and he renounced that. He left that and moved to Auroville to create this new kind of anti-materialistic society. The irony there, is that in some ways he was being bankrolled by the generosity of his father, and that money was leaking out into the wider community and was instrumental in setting up a lot of the sort of, things like a bakery early on and all of that. So I guess, like, to come back to your question, yes, the challenges of creating a non-material or even anti-material society or anti-materialist society, anti-consumerist, anti-capitalist society in a world that is capitalist and where money is very much king has been one of the central challenges that Auroville has faced, like how to create an alternative economy. I'm not sure it's solved that puzzle. I mean, it's tried, and you can give it points for trying. The effort is certainly very noble, but it's a very complicated endeavor.
So I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but let's go back to to what you touched upon just now about the revelations related to the mysterious death of John and Diane. And how did that change your relationship to your family's history, and what would you want the legacy to be?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very complicated book to write emotionally because, as a writer, you sort of get caught up in the quest and you start discovering details, you start tracking down people who feed you little tidbits about how these characters have died. I say characters in quote marks because to you as a writer they're characters, and then you come home and you excitedly share that information with your wife, and then mid-sentence you realize, of course, you're talking about her parents here. So it's a very complicated endeavor, and their deaths were painful and not easy and tragic and unnecessary. So I think there was a lot of kind of at a personal family level, there was a lot that we had to work through. I think we in some ways, I mean, people always ask me this. They say, like, how was it for your wife? How was this experience? And it was very painful, very difficult, but I think overall it was quite a cathartic experience because she was 14 years old when her parents died and she never knew how they died. And through writing this book and through researching this book, she sort of, found out, and knowledge is some form of illumination or power. So I think in that ways it was positive. You asked what would their legacy be. There's a complicated dynamic in the book, and some reviewers, I think, took me to task for this because, without giving away details, like why do John and Diane die, they basically die because they have too much faith and because they believe too strongly. And that plays out very badly in their lives. And so, it's their tragic, unnecessary deaths. Though I make the case in the book that even in these tragic, unnecessary deaths, there was something very noble about the quest and about their sort of the search that they made and the belief that they had. And I feel like it gave them, especially John, who was always a bit of a drifter in life, it gave him a kind of meaning in the last few years of his life, as difficult as they were. So I guess their legacy would be that tension between the nobility of faith and the kind of destructive capacity of too much faith.
That's a very relevant sort of tension that I think exists in the modern world today. There was a film by Govind Nihalani called Suraj Ka Satwa Ghora, and it referred to this myth of a seventh horse chariot. And it basically talked about the utopia, not as utopic, but the pursuit of utopia as being utopic and necessary for sort of accomplishing anything in life. Or having a motivation for life. So would you like to talk about that, about utopias and the pursuit of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, at some level, the book, it's very much a story, but at some level it is an exploration of the utopian impulse, which, I think is universal and has manifested in various ways historically over and over again. They're very difficult things, utopias, and I'm not sure I've quite figured them out myself. They're very noble. In some ways, I agree that without that utopian impulse, without the urge for perfection, we just get mired in what is. And so, any sort of dramatic reinvention comes from a kind of utopian impulse. On the other hand, they often end up in very bad places. I mean, the classic example of this is sort of communism in the Soviet Union, and I mean that was a classic utopian movement on a grand scale. Of course, many of these have existed on a smaller scale, but as we know, it ended up in a very bad place, and this has happened throughout history. So I think utopias are difficult. Somebody compares them to a kind of glass half full, half empty perspective, and it really depends, I guess, on your temperament. If you're somebody that admires the urge and admires the impulse and is not bothered by the gap between what happens and what, what was stated, what the sort of the goals of the endeavor, then you're going to see it as a glass half full. If you're going to focus on the imperfections and all the ways it falls short of its stated intentions and goals, then you're going to see it as half empty. I personally veer between both ways of looking at it.
So just continuing with that idea, the world is rapidly globalizing today, and to what extent would you say that utopia is plausible given that the other side of it is also true, which is the principle of exclusivity, which requires breaking away from society and establishing an alternate world?
Well, I think utopias are often very exclusive. That's one of the, less sort of appealing aspects maybe of utopias is they're often very geographically bounded and closed communities. And Auroville is criticized this way too. People think of it as a gated community. People think of it as exclusive and with some justification. So I think exclusivity is not, mutually exclusive with utopias. The question of how relevant is utopia today is something that does come up, and people ask me, often in the context of that question often starts with a statement like, we're living in really dark dystopian times, apparently, which I feel, especially on like Monday morning, I feel like we're living in pretty bad times. But I think actually historically, utopias often emerge from the darkest moments. If you look at, for example, a lot of the, what a classic utopian moment was the 60s, which actually began in the 50s, all those utopian movements, it actually emerges from the sort of detritus of World War II and the collapse of all sense of morality and all sense of decency, and the sense that all our existing institutions just couldn't protect us from anything. So it's often, and in the US, there was a flowering of utopias right after the Civil War, again, from this feeling of kind of moral, psychological bankruptcy. So I think it's often at these really dark moments that people and societies start casting about for alternatives. And that's where the utopian impulse arises. I would also add like a cautionary note to that, because that's when fanaticism rises, and utopia and fanaticism often go hand in hand. So some of the more, today we see attempts to create more egalitarian economies and create sort of, new ecological options and alternatives. But you also see the rise of very dogmatic sort of fascistic thinking, which I think is as much in its own way a sort of utopian impulse as what we might think of as the more positive aspects of utopia.
Very true, very true. And in this quest to make this ideal community, Auroville went through its own share of sort of anti-establishment revolutions, right? Can we rightly believe that there can exist a community with philosophies that suit and are agreeable to every individual? Do you want to comment on what you saw through Auroville?
Yeah, no, the short answer is no. And that's something that utopias often run up against, is that you have these ideals and you have these stated sort of big purposes, but human beings are a pretty complex, differentiated bunch, and you put them together and, they want different things and they can interpret these goals very differently. And so historically, most utopias just collapse under the weight of these differences and under the sort of tension between the undifferentiated ideal and the differentiation and the complexity of the individuals that occupy that ideal. Often the moment they collapse, especially in the case of these kind of small communities, is after the death of the founder. And so the moment I think you're referring to in the book is after, Auroville's founder was a French woman named the Mother, or she was called Mira Alfassa, but she was known as the Mother. And after her death, the community descends into basically a civil war and almost falls apart. I think it's one of the kind of the miracles of Auroville that it survived that moment and that it still exists today.
Do you think it survived because of rational thinking? Because a lot of conversations in the book are about dualities, right? Like utopia, dystopia, faith, madness. Do you think some of these tragedies could have been avoided? Would you say it's justifiable to meet the ends, often devastating, of the beliefs you have nurtured?
I think it survived for many reasons. The short reason why it survived is actually because the government of India stepped in and created a kind of protective umbrella and came in and sort of said, clean up house, basically. But I think I do think that a more complex and equally valid reason why it survived, something it could be called rationality, is that there was always this tension in Auroville between the ideals of the community and the lived reality, which I referred to. And so this was a moment when there was a kind of lived reality to Auroville that was more tied to reality, if you will. That was more on the ground, and where the people were just doing things, and they were living lives, and they were building things. And in some ways they deviated from the ideal, and some people are very upset about that to this day. They feel that they didn't uphold the sort of noble ideal of Auroville, and they're right in a way. But I also think it's one of the reasons Auroville survived, because there was it allowed a kind of organic quality to the community that allowed it to improvise and adapt and be flexible in a way that often these communities, when there's like a single top-down law or leader, don't have. It gave it a kind of flexibility. I mean, I just want to say this kind of gap between the planned reality of Auroville and Utopia more generally, and the lived everyday reality, the fact that you have to actually build this community, the fact that there's nothing on the ground, that you have a deserted plateau and a desert plateau that has to be constructed is really central to the story of Auroville. And either now or later, I could read a passage which gets into that kind of construction. It gives you a feeling of like the gap between the people who had these ideals and the guys who are actually on the ground building the community.
I'd love to hear a little passage.
Should we do a reading? What do we think?
Yes.
Okay, so this is about the sort of early founding of Auroville. Let me read it. It's the summer of 1968. Auroville is just a few months old, and it's burning under the onslaught of a terrible drought. The earth is parched. Forlorn cows and goats roam the plateau looking for a spot of green. Lines of red ants traverse the sand, dismantling corpses of geckos or insects, occasionally bigger prey, maybe a rodent or calf succumb to dehydration. Memories of Auroville's inauguration are still vivid, but the land upon which the mother's city of dawn must emerge remains empty. In Pondicherry, the planners plan. In an office across the street from the ashram, they display a papier-mâché model of the galaxy. They offer a soaring vision replete with skyscrapers, moving sidewalks, monorails, an airport, a World Trade Center, and sports facilities to host Olympic Games. The planners send out fundraising brochures to 8 organizations and governments around the world. They estimate that the mother's new city will house some 50,000 people, 50,000 idealized beings, and that the project will require $8 billion. Thus far, 13 million have been raised. But who will actually build this city? Who will brave the harsh elements, forsake the electricity and piped water of town, and settle the land? In June of 1968, 2 bicyclists make their way slowly along the Red Hill. There are no roads, hardly any tracks, and no water save what they carry in a couple of bottles tucked into cotton shoulder bags. There's no shelter except for the meager shadows offered by sporadic outgrowths of palmyra trees. The cyclists, an American man and woman, Robert and Deborah Lawler, push their way through puddles of sand. They have left Pondicherry at dawn and are dressed in thin cotton. An hour or two into the ride, and they are drenched with sweat. Deborah is a ballet dancer from California, and Robert an artist from New York. They've been living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, near the Williamsburg Bridge, in a loft dominated by a large sand casting box. Deborah is 28, and he's 29. She's fresh-faced with an oval chin. He's handsome in a rugged, frontier kind of way. They will go down in history as the first people to live in Auroville. Adam and Eve, as Deborah will later put it. Robert and Deborah have heard a lot of talk about Auroville. They don't know much about what's actually going on, but they're idealistic artists and the project intrigues them. So they've decided to go out to the Red Hill. They're just looking around, sniffing things out like prospectors. They pass through the villages outside Auroville where kids chase after them yelling, "Velakara, Velakara, white man," and then they leave the thatch huts and narrow alleys behind and they're out in the open, facing an endless horizon. They come upon a canyon, a gash in the red earth like a wound. The canyon is forbidding, some 50 feet deep and 100 across, bone dry, sun bleached, so that streaks of yellow limestone have emerged in the red laterite. Something in the starkness inspires Robert and Deborah. Robert feels that the whole area has a certain charge, the ingredients of a grand adventure. They're undaunted by the difficult conditions. They figure if they can survive on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, they can survive anywhere. They return to Pondicherry and send the mother a note asking if they can settle by the canyon. She sends a handwritten message in reply, "With my blessings." Life for these early Aurovillians is all about survival: shelter, water, food. The mother tells Robert and Deborah to construct a hexagonal cone-shaped hut, which they do, using mud for the walls and woven palmyra leaves for the roof. A new house for a new consciousness, the mother says. Their new home sits on a ridge above the canyon. The sanctuary it provides is at best partial. Mosquitoes invade at dusk and termites chew at the casuarina frame. At night, large rats climb up the hut's legs and nibble at the calluses on its sleeping inhabitants' feet. Calluses are essential in this forbidding environment, where the ground is burning and the footwear has been discarded as a civilizational frill. Robert affixes smooth metal cups on the hut's frames to keep the rats out. They live like this, clutching to what one Aurovillian later calls the thread of simplicity for several months. They refuse to be disheartened. All life is yoga, Sri Aurobindo has taught. All these obstacles are part of the great work. Just fast forward a little bit. There are periods of progress and moments of sublimity. They finally complete a well and they start planting. Cauliflower, carrots, millet, peanuts, watermelons, lentils, all of which they douse in a home brew of tobacco and chilies to keep insects away. 2 new people, an American named Francis and a Canadian named Gary, join forecomers. Together, they build more structures, including a communal dining room which they paint blue, a white meditation hut, and a bathroom with a rainbow-striped door. They lay a 23-square-foot cement floor to dry crops, and they add basketball hoop and blackboard. In the evenings, they lie shirtless on the hot cement, and the floor is touched by the sun, and they feel the heat below them and the breeze of an advancing night above, and they gaze up at the stars, and the vastness of the skies reminds them of everything that's possible here, all that they're going to achieve. Distance disappears into rest, and one's life slips away like a soiled garment, and one lies there for a moment naked, smiling, and for a trace of a moment knowing, Robert writes to friends in America. These early Aurovillians are poets. Their life is poetry. And this moment, the very beginning, pregnant with potential, unburdened by the complications that will inevitably surface, is Utopia's finest hour, when the dream remains unsullied. Robert continues, "I agree. Auroville is incomprehensible, impossible, ridiculous. Nonetheless, I know of nothing beautiful that is not also almost all 3 of these things. A painting, the growth of a flower, a relationship with another person, all are impossible. I hope I can continue here and pray for the strength that is needed."
Wonderful.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess the goal of that passage is just to convey, in terms of method, I was trying to flesh out as much detail as possible from these historical moments, which were uncharted in Auroville. But the goal is to convey the gap that existed between the kind of starkness and the harshness of what these settlers found when they first cycle out to Auroville, this grand construct, and what the planners were building in town with their World Trade Centers and their sort of Olympic stadiums. And, Auroville's always existed in that gap between those 2 realities.
So would you say today's Auroville has any untapped potential?
I think it has huge untapped potential. I think, one of the community's shortcomings, probably, as I alluded to earlier, is that it's been a bit closed off and self-contained, as these communities can always be. And so a lot of knowledge it has gained, especially in the sort of ecological sphere, has not filtered out, and we all know sort of the ecological condition in the country at large. So recently, one of the great things that's happened is, for example, the authorities in Chennai worked with one of Auroville's foremost kind of foresters to revitalize their own water bodies and to sort of bring some of that knowledge there. So I think there's been more exchange of the knowledge that Aurovillians have accrued over the years, and again, in a very self-taught way, right? These were not botanists or ecologists or anything. They were just they were improvising on the land, but some of that knowledge is starting to filter out, and I hope will continue to filter out. And at the same time, I think there's definitely been, Auroville has always been this. It's been about, it's perceived as a foreign community, but it's about 50% foreign and 50% Indian, largely local Tamil populations. But I've seen more people come in from other parts of the country in recent years. So yes, I think there is untapped potential.
So I have one last question, and then we can open it up to the audience. So you're now raising your children in Auroville. What significance do you want Auroville and its ideologies to have in their life?
I think it's Auroville. I mean, I have many hopes for it, but I think it's great for them to know and to live in a place at a young age where they can know that there are alternatives in the world. That, you know, what is, if they want to live in the mainstream world later in life, of course they should do that. But for them to at least know that there are other ways of living and other sort of options in life. I often give the example of, if I lived in a big city, or my friends who live in the big city, there's always this dynamic of, you know, when you drop your kids off at school, what car do you have and how fancy is your car? And kids are ashamed if their parents' cars aren't fancy enough. In Auroville, we sort of have the reverse dynamic where we have a kind of a beaten down old Indica car, and the shame is not that it's beaten down, but that we have a car, because it signifies kind of material possessions, and the kids are always ashamed to go to school in the car, so even on a rainy day, you know, that they prefer to put a raincoat and go. You know, it's a little silly, but I think at a young age, it does breed something slightly different in their minds, and whether they go on to be bankers or hedge funders, I hope they at least carry that knowledge with them in life.
Amazing. Questions from the audience? Yes. Or I could just... No, okay.
Does Auroville have its own governance? I'm actually just coming from Burning Man, and we are so engrossed in that whole idea of building that kind of some utopian way that we can bring back to San Francisco. Yeah. My name is Asha Jadeja, and I'm actually just a shade better than a hedge fund manager. I'm actually a venture capitalist, but I'm deeply enamored by this whole idea of self-governing bodies that care about each other and are non-transactional.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about Auroville.
Sure, and I didn't mean my comment about hedge funders to sound denigrating. Because many of my, honestly, like many of my close friends work in finance, and that was it. My point was just that there are many options and paths in life, and I want them to know these different pathways. Governance is one, like along with economy, has been one of the kind of central challenges. The goal, like with the economy, was to invent something radically new. And sometimes Aurovilians say that they live in what they like to call divine anarchy. That it can be productive in some ways. It can also be very unproductive in some ways. So there have been various attempts to create government, but we don't want to have traditional democracy because traditional democracy gets captured by lobby groups. But then on the other hand, if you don't have traditional democracy, what tends to creep into the space is a kind of more, I wouldn't say authoritarian, but maybe like oligarchic type thing where you get elites that sort of dominate the space. So it's an ongoing effort. I will say that often the lack of governance and kind of clear authority is seen as one of the weak points in the community, and it's true that it makes it hard to get things done. But I also think in a way it's what's allowed the community to survive, because these types of very intentionally minded communities, when you have too much authority, you get a very strong imposition of a particular rigid point of view, which doesn't allow for that kind of flexibility and complexity of human nature. And those who have other ideas end up leaving. They don't feel welcome, or they're kicked out of the community. And so the lack of kind of authority has allowed the community in some ways to proceed more organically and find its way, if that makes sense. Organically. It may be reaching the limits of that, because there's a matter of scale as well. That when you're 500 people, you can make decisions by all attending meetings and kind of like screaming and working it out. Now that it's closer to 3,000 people, that has reached its limits. So I think it may be reaching the limits of being able to exist without kind of governance, but it's been an interesting process.
Akash, Ritendra, I do work in finance, but I'm a big fan of your book. So 2 questions. One is, and the reason I'm a big fan is you take us on this journey for 20, 30 years, which is very visual. And it's, as you said, there are few different genres that you kind of fit into this, one being history, one being a family journey. And it's just brilliant. You don't know what to expect as you go through it, and it shifts. So, lovely book. Couple of my 2 questions. The first one is when you start with the history of Auroville, you talk about, you kind of set this context of colonial India. It's set in Black Town. Can you touch a little bit about like what attracted these people in that era to come to middle of nowhere, follow this person who is not really a traditional messiah. He's not like, I don't know, Vivekananda who comes to New York and speaks. He's not known for any new theology. So what attracts it? Force of personality? Is it just the time? Is it organic? Like, what is it that drew people initially to middle of nowhere in colonial India to this guy?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and I think the easy answer is that it's a combination of forces. But I think that the era was a huge thing, of course, right? It was an era of searchers, and I mean I say that somewhere in the book where I say that we always all have the utopian impulse. I mean, anybody who wakes up in the morning wishing for a better world has a utopian impulse. But then, as I say, some moments in history seem to provide more scaffolding for those impulses, right? Where it seems more almost normal to be abnormal and to sort of quit, drop out of the world the way, I was referring to John Walker does. So that moment in the 60s is, and in some ways Auroville comes at the tail end of it, is just populated. The world is full of these searchers, these questers, these seekers, and these early Aurovillians are all searching for alternatives. And I think, so they go all over the world. Some of them end up with the Maharishi. I mean, we all know that they head towards the east looking for spirituality. Some of them end up with Maharishi. Some of them end up in Osho. But some of them end up in the ashram with Sri Aurobindo and the mother. To what extent they're specifically attracted by that specific version of yoga, I think it's mixed. I think some of them have read the works. I mean, Aurobindo is in my view, a phenomenal philosopher, but very hard to read and difficult and complex. So I don't think everybody who shows up there has really digested everything he said and understood it. Some have, and some have read kind of introductions, if you will, to his work. There's a Frenchman in my book called Bernard who writes a book called The Adventure of Consciousness, which is a sort of, I don't want to say a simplified version, but it's an introduction to Sri Aurobindo's teachings, and a lot of people read that book and come there. So I think the moment plays a huge part. A lot of the early people who end up there are French. Pondicherry was a former French colony. France was going through its whole thing, right? May 1968. Like, a lot of those people are fed up with society. They want something new. They hear about this French woman running an ashram in Pondicherry, and they end up there.
It's fascinating, right? I would love if you write another book which kind of, there's no one answer, as you're saying. It's just all these people coming to this place in an era.
Yeah.
We don't have media. We don't know who he is. He's really hard to understand. So I think that's...
Yeah. Well, they're finding his books. They're finding his, it's interesting because I've read sort of like letters from people, even earlier, there was a Margaret Wilson, who was the daughter of President Wilson, who actually ends up in the ashram in, I believe it's the late 30s, and dies there in the 40s. So she was living here in New York. She had basically been the first lady in the White House because her mother was dead. So she discovers Aurobindo in the New York Public Library. And then sort of goes from there and starts writing to him. But she goes there. So this has been going on for a while. They're finding his books, yes, pre-internet. And then there was this, when you say writing more, that there's this, I don't know if you know about the hippie trail that existed at the time. It was this fascinating, you can look it up. There was the route that led through Turkey, through Iran, through Afghanistan, through Pakistan, that they were all following. Many of these people followed that hippie trail. They tell these amazing stories of being in Kandahar or whatever in the 60s and the 70s, and of course that all fell apart with what first the Iranian Revolution and then the invasion of Afghanistan. The hippie trail sort of fell apart, and that's actually one of the many reasons why that whole influx of sort of spiritual seekers and hippie people also dies out. One of the many reasons, along with like Reagan and Thatcher and all of that in the 80s, but it sort of dies out in that era.
Got it. Then my second question was actually about Margaret Wilson, because I don't see, to me it's a huge big deal for American president's daughter to live and die there, right? I mean, she died there. But then that wasn't a big part of your book in the early history, so she didn't have much of an impact, or like, is she lost in history? Like, what's...
It's interesting because I've been thinking of writing an article about Margaret Wilson, so it's good to know there's at least one person that would be interested in it. It was a different time, right? It would have been complicated to fit in the book because she was there in the late 30s and then died in the early 40s, whereas this book mostly happens in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it would have been complicated to fit her in. There are definitely, resonances with John Walker, this very privileged East Coast person that sort of like is it's not enough. Their world is not, they have everything, but it's not enough for them, and they're looking for something more, and they're looking for something different, and they end up there. I don't think she had a huge impact in that sense. I think she dropped out. She moved there. Her letters are available. Like I was just reading them in the archives in the ashram. Fascinating letters back to her friends and family here. She was an interesting woman. And she also, like John Walker, I'm giving her a bit of the plot, but she died because she got sick and denied herself medical care. And her family wanted to bring her back to see the best doctors in the US. And she says, well, the doctors in America can cure me, but what can they do for my soul? And she ends up dying.
You should definitely write it, because Woodrow Wilson, when you go to Woodrow Wilson's house, they don't know that she went to India.
Yeah.
They kind of have a picture, and they don't know that she changed her name she took the name Nishtha.
She took the name Nishtha.
So I think that would be something I would definitely read. And my daughter's name is Nishtha as well. So.
Okay, good. Two readers for the article. Good. Thank you.
Do we have time for one last question, Debanuj?
Hi, I'm Debanuj. I'm a professor of feminist studies at UC Santa Barbara. So I also haven't read your book, but I was really fascinated by how you were reading and the amount of details you have. So do you think it's an oral history genre as well? Secondly, I wanted to just ask you about, if you think it's an utopia, what about gender and sexuality in this utopia? And how is Auroville offering a different utopic gender relation?
Yeah. So the first question, thank you for noticing the detail, because it was something I really wanted to do. By the way, I studied anthropology myself, and I'm very into oral narratives. And in fact, my last book was more, I would say, kind of oral narrative, because I would actually do long oral narratives and passages. But here, the method was oral narratives, and it was fascinating and maddening to reconstruct history through oral narratives, because there's not that much documentary evidence. So you would be interviewing people, and sometimes you would literally spend an hour with them to find out the color of the bus, But I was really determined to give it that texture and that sort of flavor. Like, you would want to know what color things were, what did they smell. I also found this wealth of weather data, and so I could use that to triangulate sort of like something happens on a particular day. Well, was it raining that day? Was it raining the night before? And so that was very helpful. And then John's letters were a treasure trove, because he was a beautiful lyrical writer who wrote with tremendous amount of detail. So that was definitely part of the method. In terms of your other question, it's an interesting question. I would say Auroville has not done a very good job in that regard. In some ways, it's getting better now, and that's partly generational, but in some ways, it has had the worst tendencies of a small town, particularly when it comes to like homosexuality. I had a friend when I was young who was gay. It was very hard for him. It was a very kind of macho settler culture, if you will. And yeah, just it wasn't very open and tolerant. It has changed to a degree, and I think that's partly generational. I think the younger generation is just inherently different, but it is not a utopian aspect of the community.
I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Akash.
Thank you all. Thank you all.